This marriage means nothing. The scent of bleach and lemon was my only companion, a familiar perfume that clung to my clothes and hair long after I'd clocked out. It was the smell of survival, of rent paid just in time, of another day scraped through. My tiny walk-up apartment was a world away from the gleaming towers I cleaned, a place of second-hand furniture and dreams I was starting to fear would never come true. I'd spend my nights looking out my smudged window at the city lights, wondering what it was like to live in one of them instead of just cleaning up after the people who did. The 64th floor of the Omnicorp Tower was a ghost town after midnight, a silent world of glass and steel suspended over the glittering, indifferent heart of the city. My reflection, a tired woman of 25 with eyes that had seen too much exhaustion and not enough life, moved with me across the polished marble. I was mopping my way toward the executive washroom when the first sound cut through the sterile quiet. It wasn't loud, a muffled thud like a heavy book falling from a great height. I froze, my hands tightening on the mop handle. The building's security was legendarily tight, but my heart, a frantic bird in my chest, didn't seem to care about legends. I told myself it was nothing. It was always nothing. But then came the second sound, a low, guttural curse in a language I didn't recognize, followed by a sickeningly wet crack. This time I didn't hesitate. I dropped the mop, its clatter unnaturally loud in the silence, and ducked behind a large marble planter, my breath catching in my throat. The elevator at the far end of the hall chimed its arrival. The pervasive aroma of bleach and lemon served as a constant reminder of my reality, a scent that lingered on my skin like a badge of manual labor. This chemical perfume represented survival, the thin line between a roof over my head and the unforgiving streets. My cramped, walk-up apartment, filled with worn-out furniture and fading aspirations, stood in stark contrast to the luxurious skyscrapers I spent my nights scrubbing. From my window, I watched the city's glowing skyline, wondering if I would ever belong among those lights rather than just polishing the floors of those who did. At 1 a.m., the 64th floor of the Omnicorp Tower was a desolate landscape of cold steel and glass. As I mopped the marble, my reflection revealed a 25-year-old woman aged prematurely by fatigue. The sterile silence was suddenly shattered by a dull thud, echoing like a heavy object hitting the floor. Despite the building's supposedly impenetrable security, a primal fear took hold of me. I tried to dismiss the noise as a trick of the mind, but a second sound followed, a harsh, guttural curse in an unfamiliar tongue, followed by a gruesome, wet crack that signaled violence. Panic surged through me. Abandoning my mop, which hit the floor with a deafening bang, I scrambled for cover behind a massive marble planter. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I tried to stifle my breathing. Just as I retreated into the shadows, the distant, cheerful chime of the elevator signaled an arrival, turning the quiet executive floor into a stage for something far more dangerous than a routine night shift. The doors slid open, not with the gentle whisper of a corporate conveyance, but with a harsh metallic clang. 3 men spilled out, their movements sharp and predatory. They were not executives. Their suits were too sharp, their shoulders too broad, and the bulges beneath their jackets were not wallets. They dragged a 4th man between them, his expensive shoes scuffing trails of blood on my freshly cleaned floor. They were speaking in rapid, angry Russian, and though I couldn't understand the words, the intent was universal. Violence was a language all its own. They forced the man to his knees before the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. He was begging, his voice thick with terror. I pressed myself smaller, my cheeks scraping against the rough ceramic of the planter, praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Be invisible. Be nothing. The leader of the group pulled a gun, a dark, ugly thing that seemed to absorb the light. I squeezed my eyes shut, but you can't unhear a gunshot. It was deafening in the enclosed space. A final, brutal punctuation mark that echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. When I dared to open my eyes, the man was gone. And there was a spiderweb of cracks in the reinforced glass. A dark stain was spreading across the marble. I must have made a sound. A choked gasp. A whimper. The leader turned toward me with ice-cold, wintry eyes that held no shock, only the clinical annoyance one might feel when spotting a pest. As he leveled his weapon, time dilated. I stared into the dark void of the barrel, certain that my unremarkable life was reaching its final chapter. However, before he could pull the trigger, the office doors exploded open. A team of shadows dressed in black swarmed the corridor with lethal fluidity. The air filled with the muted thuds of suppressed gunfire, ending the confrontation in a matter of seconds. The pale-eyed man was the last to fall, his arrogance finally replaced by genuine surprise. As a heavy, menacing silence returned to the hall, I remained paralyzed behind my cover. A pair of polished leather shoes eventually came to a halt before me. I looked up, tracing a path from a tailored suit to a face defined by a chilling, devastating beauty. This was Kang Min-jun. His dark, calculating eyes surveyed the carnage before settling on me. In my trembling form and worn uniform, he seemed to find a flicker of unexpected defiance. "You have a choice," he stated, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm rumble. "You are either a liability to be erased, or an asset to be utilized. A loose end. Or you can be an asset that I own. Marry me." The silk of the wedding dress felt like a shroud. It was a couture creation, heavy with thousands of seed pearls that whispered against my skin with every terrified breath. I stood before a wall of mirrors in a suite larger than my entire apartment, a place of gilded opulence and silent menace. A woman I didn't know, with a face as impassive as stone, was adjusting the veil, her fingers deft and cold. She was one of his people. Everyone here was one of his people. I was the only foreign object in this perfectly curated world, a bird with broken wings placed in a golden cage. Looking at my reflection, I saw a stranger, a beautiful haunted doll with wide, dark eyes and skin that glowed like polished mahogany against the stark white of the gown. This was the asset, not Anya the cleaner who dreamed of opening a small bookstore where people could find quiet refuge, but a piece on a chessboard, a beautiful prop for a deadly game. This wasn't a wedding, it was an acquisition. The wedding ceremony unfolded as a disorienting blend of ancient tradition and sheer, paralyzing terror. We were gathered within the private chapel of his sprawling estate, an architectural marvel defined by soaring stone arches and stained glass windows. The saints depicted in the glass seemed to look down not with a blessing, but with a solemn, judgmental air. The pews offered no comfort, they weren't occupied by loving friends or family, but by his high-ranking lieutenants. These men, characterized by their hardened expressions and vigilant eyes, wore dark suits that created a morbid, funereal contrast against the stark white of my bridal gown. Their presence filled the room with a heavy, palpable loyalty, a silent, unbreakable pledge to the formidable Korean mafia sovereign who stood at the altar, waiting to claim me. Kang Min-jun possessed the commanding aura of a monarch in his bespoke tuxedo. He stood with a terrifying stillness, reminiscent of a predator momentarily at rest. When my hand, cold and visibly shaking, was finally placed in his grip was firm and overtly possessive. It served as a wordless reinforcement of the grim arrangement that had brought us to this moment. There was no warmth or joy in his expression, he did not smile. Instead, his gaze was analytical and detached, moving over me with the clinical precision of a buyer inspecting a recent acquisition for any hidden flaws. The exchange of vows felt like a cruel mockery of the divine, a sequence of sacred promises stripped of all meaning by the reality of our union. As he slid the platinum band onto my finger, the weight of the massive diamond felt less like a romantic gesture and more like a masterfully crafted manacle, chaining me to his world. Though his touch was brief and impersonal, it triggered a sudden, jarring jolt of awareness within me, a flicker of heat that momentarily pierced through the icy landscape of my dread. Once the hollow ceremony concluded, the crowd dispersed, leaving us in the suffocating privacy of his study. The room was a sanctuary of dark masculinity, lined with mahogany panels and thick with the heavy, lingering scent of aged whiskey and leather-bound books. Here, the reality of my new life began to settle in, as heavy and inescapable as the ring on my finger. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light as he swirled it in the crystal glass. He didn't offer me one. I was not a guest. "Let us be clear," he said, turning to face me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "This marriage means nothing. It is a contract, a strategic maneuver to quiet the questions about the incident you witnessed. The Russian syndicate who saw you are under the impression you are now under my protection as my wife. It makes you an untouchable target, and it gives me, a powerful man in my position, a convenient reason to have eliminated them. It is clean." He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "You are a business asset. You will live in my house, where my clothes bear my name. In return, you will breathe, you will be loyal, you will be silent, and you will be obedient. Do you understand your role, Anya?" The way he said my name the first time he had spoken it since that night was like the flick of a whip. It was a claim. I could only nod, my throat too tight to form words. He saw the tears threatening to spill from my eyes, and a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps impatience crossed his features. Tears are useless here, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft tone. You are no longer the frightened girl on the floor. You are the wife of a powerful mafia boss. You are my wife. Start acting like it. He placed the glass down with a decisive click. You're Mrs. Kong now. Remember that. Life in Kong Minjun's mansion was a lesson in contradictions. It was a fortress disguised as a palace, a cage wrought from marble and gold. Every surface gleamed, every room was filled with priceless art, and from my bedroom window I had a staggering view of the city that was now my prison. I was surrounded by a silent, efficient staff who catered to my every need before I could even voice it, yet I had never felt more alone. They were polite, deferential, but their eyes were always watching. They were his eyes. If I asked a simple question about my husband's day, they would offer a polite, empty smile and change the subject. My days fell into a strange, suspended rhythm. I would wake in a bed large enough for 6, eat meals prepared by a personal chef in a dining room that could host a state dinner, and wander the cavernous, silent halls of my new home. Minjun was a phantom. He left before I woke and returned long after I had retreated to my room. Our only interactions were brief, perfunctory collisions in a hallway, or a shared silent moment in his study where he worked and I sat reading a book, the silence between us thick with unspoken tension. I once saw him through the crack of the door on a video call, his Korean sharp and unforgiving. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a commander, and the man on the other end of the screen was visibly shrinking under the force of his authority. He was the architect of my confinement. Yet I found myself studying him. I noticed the way his iron control frayed ever so slightly when he was deep in thought, a muscle feathering in his jaw. I saw the deep-seated weariness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking as he stared out the window into the night. I learned that he preferred black tea, that he never touched sweets and that he had a faint, almost invisible scar bisecting his left eyebrow. These small human details were terrifying because they made him real. More than just the monster who had bought my life. I began to test the boundaries of my gilded cage. One afternoon I walked out into the meticulously manicured gardens, breathing in the scent of rain-soaked earth and roses. I walked toward the high stone walls that enclosed the property, my heart beginning to pound with a wild, foolish hope. I had made it almost to the gate when Mr. Hin, his ever-present stoic lieutenant, seemed to materialize from the shadows. Mrs. Kong, he said, his voice respectful but firm. It is not safe for you to be out here alone. The master would be displeased. The message was clear. I was not to leave. I turned back, the fight draining out of me. That evening, Minjun found me in the library, a vast 2-story room that was the only place in the house that felt like a sanctuary. I was curled in a leather armchair, a book lying forgotten in my lap. You went to the gate today, he stated. Not a question I didn't answer. My silence. A small rebellion. Do not do it again, he continued, his voice low and devoid of heat, which was somehow more frightening. The men I killed to protect you have friends. They believe you are my weakness. The moment you step outside that wall, you are dead, and your death would be an inconvenience I do not have time for. His words were cruel, designed to remind me of my status as an object. An inconvenience. But as he turned to leave, he paused. The East Wing is off limits. Everywhere else is yours. It wasn't kindness, but it was a concession, a crack in the bars of my cage. Later that night, a maid entered my room with a tray. On it was a plate of warm, freshly baked madeleines and a steaming cup of chamomile tea. The master thought you might be hungry, she said softly, avoiding my eyes. I stared at the tray long after she left. He had noticed my uneaten dinner. He had remembered a passing comment I'd made weeks ago to a housekeeper about my love for French pastry. This small, almost imperceptible act of observation was more unsettling than any of his threats. The monster had been watching, and he had seen something more than just an asset. He had seen me. A week later, he announced our departure. Pack a bag, we're leaving in the morning, he said, finding me in the conservatory among the orchids. He offered no further explanation. He simply stated it as fact and walked away, the expectation of my compliance hanging in the humid air. The word honeymoon was never spoken, but the implications were clear. This was a public performance, another move in his grand, violent game. We were to present the image of a newly married couple, solidifying the lie that bound us. The destination was a private villa on a secluded stretch of the California coastline, a place of dramatic rock and turquoise water. It was breathtakingly beautiful, an idyllic paradise that felt like a cruel joke given our circumstances. The flight on his private jet was silent and tense. I sat across from him, pretending to read a novel, but my eyes kept drifting up to watch the powerful Korean mafia boss at work. His laptop was open, his phone pressed to his ear as he issued a stream of clipped, ruthless commands in Korean. He was a man constantly at war, and I was his latest acquisition of territory. The villa was a masterpiece of contemporary design, a striking composition of transparent glass and deep-toned wood anchored firmly into a rugged cliffside. Below, the sea churned with an indifferent power. While the location was undeniably beautiful, its isolation served a dual purpose: it was easily defensible and entirely inescapable. As his security detail, overseen by the perpetually vigilant Mr. Han, moved with practiced efficiency to secure the perimeter, Min Jun guided me into the interior. He informed me, in a voice devoid of emotion, that this would be our residence for the coming week. He emphasized that the local staff had been thoroughly vetted and issued a stern directive: the true nature of our arrangement was never to be mentioned. In public and private, I was to inhabit the role of his wife. The defiance I had been suppressing finally fractured my composure. My fear was momentarily eclipsed by a surge of indignity. I questioned him sharply, my voice laced with a bitterness I couldn't hide. I demanded to know the specifics of the performance he expected. Was I to play the part of the smitten bride or the blissful newlywed? I mocked the absurdity of the situation, asking if I was meant to offer him adoring glances over breakfast while surrounded by armed guards. For the first time, Min Jun's mask of calculation slipped, revealing a flash of genuine, volatile anger. It was a brief, dangerous spark that he suppressed almost as quickly as it appeared. He closed the distance between us, his presence overwhelming and suffocating. Rather than retreating, I stood my ground as he leaned in to deliver a silken, terrifying ultimatum. He whispered that the only role I needed to perfect was that of a woman who valued her life. He acknowledged my intelligence but warned me against the fatal mistake of letting pride turn into foolishness. Later that evening, the tension shifted from overt threats to something far more complex. As I stood on the balcony, lost in the vastness of the ocean, he joined me. When the wind blew a stray lock of hair across my eyes, he reached out, his fingers gently tucking it back. This unexpected touch felt like an electric shock, a moment of forced intimacy that felt more perilous than his verbal warnings. His thumb lingered against my cheek, his gaze searching mine for an unnameable emotion. "My enemies are watching," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the crashing waves, reminding me that even this gesture was part of a deadly game. "They think you are my vulnerability. They see a soft, frightened woman. They are waiting for me to be distracted by my new bride." He finally dropped his hand and turned his gaze to the horizon. "Let them watch." That night, he entered my room and placed a small, heavy object on the nightstand. It was a handgun, compact and deadly. I stared at it, my blood running cold. "What is this?" I whispered. "I do not expect you will need this," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "My men are the best, but I do not like leaving things to chance." "Why are you giving this to me? You think I won't use it on you?" His eyes met mine, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "A cornered animal is more dangerous than a loyal one. I am giving you the hints of which to be. It is a Sig Sauer. The safety is here. You point it and you pull the trigger. Do not hesitate. This was my honeymoon gift, a piece of steel and death." It was a terrifying gesture, but it was also something else. The first time he had ever trusted me with anything. The attack came on the third night, under the covert of a raging thunderstorm. The sky had turned a bruised purple and the wind howled like a hungry wolf against the glass walls of the villa. The power cut out suddenly, plunging the world into a disorienting darkness, broken only by the frantic strobe, like flashes of lightning. In that first split second of blackness, I knew it wasn't a simple power outage. It was a prelude. The sharp crack of unsilenced gunfire from the perimeter confirmed it, a sound that ripped through the roar of the storm. Min Jun was across the living room from me in an instant, his body a solid wall of muscle, pushing me down behind a thick marble sofa. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal growl in my ear. The casual elegance was gone, replaced by the coiled lethality of a predator. He already had his own weapon in his hand, moving with a fluid grace that was terrifying to behold. The sounds of a fierce close-quarters battle erupted throughout the house. Shouts, the splintering of wood, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. Mr. Hin and the other guards were fighting back, but our attackers had come in force. They had used the storm as cover, a classic, brutal tactic. A flash of lightning illuminated a figure smashing through the glass doors of the balcony. He was huge, dressed in black tactical gear, a Russian rifle in his hands. Minjun didn't hesitate. 2 suppressed shots, precise and economical, and the man crumpled to the ground. But another came right behind him. A bullet ricocheted off the marble fireplace, sending chips of stone flying past my head. I could hear Minjun grunt in pain, a sharp, ragged sound. In the next flash of lightning, I saw it, a dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his white shirt, just below the shoulder. He was hit. He stumbled slightly, firing back, but his movements were a fraction slower. The invaders were closing in, their goal clear. Get to him. Get to the boss. They saw him as wounded and me as nothing. A terrified woman cowering behind a couch. They were right about the terrified part. My entire body was shaking, my teeth chattering. But as I watched Minjun fight, bleeding, protecting the space around me, something else rose through the fear. It was a white-hot, primal rage. They were trying to kill him. This man who owned me, who had caged me, who had shown me a sliver of something almost human. He was mine in his own twisted way, and they were not going to take him. My mind went to the gun upstairs, the honeymoon gift. Scrabbling on my hands and knees, keeping low, I moved away from the firefight, using the darkness and chaos as cover. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a deafening drum. I flew up the stairs, my bare feet silent on the cold stone. I found the gun on the nightstand, my hand closing around the cool, heavy metal. It felt alien, but my fingers found the grip, the trigger. Just as he'd shown me, a man appeared at the top of the stairs, blocking my path back down. He saw me, a woman in a silk nightgown, holding a gun, and he laughed. It was a fatal mistake. He thought I was a damsel. A prop. He raised his rifle too slowly, too arrogantly. I didn't think. I didn't aim in any classical sense. I just pointed. The image of Minjun falling burned into my mind, and I pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil jarring, my arm to the shoulder. The man stared at me, his eyes wide with shock, a dark hole appearing in his chest. He fell backward, tumbling down the stairs. I didn't wait to watch him land. I scrambled back down, my ears ringing. In the main room, Minjun was pinned down, 2 men advancing on his position. He saw me, and for a single, infinite moment, his face registered pure, unadulterated shock. He froze. He saw the gun in my hand, the wild look in my eyes, the blood that wasn't mine splattered on my gown. It was the last thing he or anyone had ever expected, that moment of hesitation. His and his enemies was all I needed. I raised the gun and fired again and again. The ordinary, financially struggling woman was gone, burned away in gunpowder and desperation. In her place was a queen drenched in the storm, defending her king. The world came back into focus, slowly filtered through the ringing in my ears and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The storm outside still raged, a fitting soundtrack to the carnage within. The bodies of our attackers lay twisted on the expensive rugs. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the gun, its weight a terrible, anchoring reality. My gaze was fixed on Minjun. He was leaning against the fireplace, his face pale, his breathing shallow. But his eyes were on me, and the look in them was something I had never seen before. The cold calculation was gone. The commanding arrogance had vanished. In its place was a raw, staggering astonishment that seemed to shake him to his very core. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time, not as an asset or a contract, but as a terrifying and magnificent revelation. He had expected me to hide, to perhaps use the gun in a last, desperate act of self-preservation. He had never imagined I would charge back into the fight to defend him. His trusted men, Mr. Hin among them, were now securing the room, their movements swift and professional. But their gazes kept flicking towards me with a mixture of awe and fear. I was no longer the fragile foreign wife. I was the woman who had stood her ground while the world burned down around her. I let the gun fall from my nerveless fingers. It clattered loudly on the stone floor. The sound broke the spell. Minjun pushed himself off the mantelpiece, hissing in pain as the movement jarred his wounded shoulder. He ignored his men and came directly to me, his steps unsteady. He stopped in front of me, his height and presence still overwhelming, but the dynamic between us had irrevocably fractured and reformed. He reached out, not with the possessive grip of a master but with a trembling hand, and cupped my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin gently, trying to wipe away the flecks of blood that weren't mine. Anya. He breathed my name, a prayer and a question on his lips. His other hand went to my arm, his grip urgent, as if he needed to assure himself I was real. His eyes scanned me from head to toe, checking for injuries I hadn't even registered. It was only then, under his frantic gaze, that I realized the depth of his shock was rooted in fear. The fear for me. The powerful mafia boss who had declared our marriage meaningless was terrified of losing me. I started to tremble then, the adrenaline deserting me, leaving behind a hollow, quaking horror at what I had done. My knees gave way, but he caught me, pulling me against his chest, his uninjured arm wrapping around me like a steel band. He held me tightly, tucking my head under his chin, his body a shield against the dead men and the storm. I have you, he murmured into my hair, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. Sarong. I have you. I didn't know what the word meant, but in the shelter of his arms, with the scent of his skin and his blood filling my senses, I felt the first stirrings of a dangerous, terrifying truth. I had not killed to save my own life. I had killed to save his. And in that violent, bloody moment, the contract had been broken and something far more binding had been forged in its place. We never spoke of the gunshots or the bodies. His men were ghosts, cleaning the chaos with silent, chilling efficiency until the villa was once again a pristine, beautiful prison, the only evidence of the night's violence the boarded-up glass doors and the lingering scent of disinfectant. Mr. Hin, a man I had only ever seen as a stoic statue, brought me a glass of brandy with a hand that was not entirely steady and a look of profound, unnerving respect in his eyes. He addressed me as Samanam, a title of honor for the wife of a chairman, and the word held a new weight, a new truth. Minjun had refused a doctor barking orders at his men that he was fine, but the blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on his arm told a different story. I found him in his bathroom, stripped to the waist, trying and failing to clean the wound himself. His face was tight with pain, a sheen of sweat on his brow. The man who controlled a criminal empire couldn't manage a simple piece of gauze. For the first time since I'd met him, I felt no fear, only a fierce, protective ache in my chest. I reached for the medical kit, silencing his prideful protests with a steady, unyielding gaze. For a moment, the formidable mafia boss hesitated before relenting, sinking onto the edge of the marble tub. I worked with unexpected composure, cleaning a raw, jagged bullet graze that had torn through his muscle. Though he remained motionless, I could feel the intense vibration of his controlled agony. As I stitched the wound, my fingers moved across a landscape of old scars, silent testaments to a violent history. When I finished, my hand lingered on his shoulder. They underestimated you, he murmured, his voice resonating through my palm. They saw a trinket, a weakness. So did I. Turning to face me, he captured my hand, his grip shifting from possessive to profoundly connected. The cold authority of his rank vanished, replaced by a raw, startling vulnerability. He confessed that our marriage contract and his previous threats were lies he told himself to maintain control. He admitted that from the moment he saw me hiding in the tower, terrified yet defiant, I was never merely an asset. Seeing me later, armed and bloodstained, he realized he wasn't shocked by my capacity for violence, but by the depth of his own feelings. I was frozen with the realization that I could not bear to lose you. That my life means nothing if you are not in it. The confession hung in the air between us, more explosive than any gunshot. He, Kong Min Jun, was admitting to a weakness, and he was naming it me. Our return to the city was a silent declaration of a new regime. We walked off his private jet side by side, not as master and possession, but as partners. His arm was in a black silk sling, a visible sign of the battle that had been won. And his hand rested possessively on the small of my back, a public claim that felt entirely different now. It was not a warning to me, but a warning to the world: she is mine. Touch her and die. The staff at the mansion lined up to greet us, their heads bowed low. But this time their eyes, when they dared to look at me, were filled with a deference that bordered on reverence. The story of the honeymoon had traveled faster than we had. I was no longer the frightened bride. I was the Samanam who had defended the master, the woman who had met violence with violence. I was a queen who had earned her crown in blood. Minjun led me directly to his study, the heart of his empire. But instead of leaving me to my books, he gestured for me to sit in the leather chair opposite his desk, the one reserved for his most trusted advisors. Mr. Hin entered, placing a tablet on the desk. The remaining Bratville leadership responsible for the attack, Minjun said, his voice cold as ice as he swiped through images of grim-faced Russian men. They thought to send a message. By targeting my home, my wife. They have exposed their entire command structure in the process, a foolish emotional move. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face. They will be eliminated. All of them. There will be no half measures. I want you to understand the world you are a part of now, Anya. There is no going back. I looked at the faces on the screen. Men who had wanted me dead, who had hurt him. I felt no pity, only a cold, hard certainty. I understand, I said, my voice clear and steady. They made the mistake of thinking your wife was a weakness. Show them she is your greatest strength. A slow, dangerous smile touched Minjun's lips for the very first time. It transformed his face, making him look both devastatingly handsome and utterly lethal. Indeed, from that day forward, my education began. He no longer shielded me from his life. He immersed me in it. He explained the complex web of his businesses, both legitimate and illicit. He taught me about logistics, about finances, about loyalty and betrayal. I sat in on his meetings with his lieutenants, a silent presence at first, one day discussing a rival's shipping routes. He paused the meeting and turned to me. What do you see? He asked. His men looked confused. I pointed to the schedule. The security patrols are weakest during the early morning shift change, but that's a decoy. The cargo of value is never on those trucks. It moves with the food service deliveries. No one ever checks the catering vans. Minjun's smile was predatory. My quiet, observant nature, once a tool for survival as an invisible cleaner, was now a formidable weapon. I was becoming more than his wife. I was becoming his partner, his confidant, his secret weapon. The gilded cage had transformed into a throne room and I was finally learning the language of power. The nights became our sanctuary. The brutal, high-stakes world would fall away and in the quiet of the mansion, we would find each other. The fear that had once defined my existence was replaced by a sense of belonging so profound it frightened me more than any assassin's bullet. He had never been a man of easy words or grand romantic gestures. His love was shown in actions. It was in the way he would have the chef prepare my favorite Nigerian jollof rice just because he knew it reminded me of a home I no longer missed. It was in the way he would find me in the library and simply sit with me in silence, his presence a comforting weight, a silent promise that I was no longer alone. It was in the heightened security, the armored cars, the constant presence of his guards, not to confine me, but to build an impenetrable fortress around me. One evening, I found him standing in the east wing, the one part of the house he had forbidden me from entering. The door was open. He turned as I approached, his expression uncharacteristically soft. Come, he said, holding out his hand. The wing was not another opulent set of rooms. It was a nursery. It was furnished not for a baby, but for a child, with a small bed, shelves of classic books in both Korean and English, and a beautifully carved wooden horse. It was all covered in a fine layer of dust, a room frozen in time. I had a younger sister, he said, his voice thick with an old, unhealed grief. Her name was Sujin. She was everything good in this world. Our parents were killed when I was 19, and I took over the family business. I tried to protect her from it, to keep her world clean. He ran a hand over the wooden horse. She loved this horse. She'd pretend she was a knight riding into battle. The Bratva, the same organization from the villa, they targeted her to get to me. She was 16-inch. He didn't need to finish the story. The unbearable sadness in the room told the rest of it. This was the source of his coldness, the reason he had tried to keep me at a distance, to treat me as nothing more than an asset. He had been terrified of history repeating itself, of loving someone, only to have them torn away as a consequence of his life. She's why I built these walls so high, he whispered, turning to me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I failed her. I will not fail you. I stepped into his arms, my own heart aching for the boy he had been and the man he had been forced to become. I held him, offering what little comfort I could. You haven't failed me, Minjun, I murmured into his chest. You've given me a home. He held me tighter, burying his face in my hair. You, he said, his voice choked with emotion. You are my home, Anya. my sarong, my everything. In that dusty, silent room filled with ghosts, we found our truth. We were two broken people, forged in violence and loss, who had somehow found a way to make each other whole. His love wasn't gentle or poetic. It was fierce, possessive and absolute. And I in turn, loved him with a terrifying intensity. A love born in fear and baptized in blood. Months later, we stood on the 64th floor of the Omnicorp Tower. The space was no longer a sterile corporate hallway, but part of Minjun's private penthouse suite, the entire floor now belonging to him. We stood before the same floor-to-ceiling window, the one that had once borne the spiderweb cracks of a gunshot. It was seamless now, offering an unbroken, godlike view of the city glittering below. I was no longer in a cleaner's uniform, but a bespoke gown of deep crimson silk that clung to my body. A heavy diamond necklace, a gift from my husband, rested against my collarbone, its coolness a familiar weight. Minjun stood behind me, his arms wrapped around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. His presence was no longer a threat, but the center of my universe, the anchor that kept me steady. The last of the Brotville leadership in the city had been dealt with that afternoon. The news had been delivered by Mr. Hin with a simple, respectful nod. It was over. The threat was gone. We were safe. Do you ever think about that night? I asked softly, my reflection as strangers. A powerful, confident woman I was still getting to know the first time we met, right here. I think about it every day, he murmured, his lips brushing against my temple. I think about the terrified woman with the heart of a lioness. I think about how I almost made the greatest mistake of my life by letting you go. He tightened his grip, pulling me more firmly against his chest. I built an empire of money and fear, Anya, but it was empty. The structure surrounding us was a fortress, yet its true value lay not in its walls, but in what they contained. Min Jun turned me toward him, his dark eyes radiating a consuming, profound affection that never failed to leave me breathless. He spoke with a gravity that shook me, declaring that I was the very soul of his vast empire, its queen. He laid his entire existence and all his power at my feet, surrendering everything he was to me. I reached up to trace the thin scar near his eyebrow, a tiny flaw upon his otherwise striking features. I reflected on the woman I used to be, the timid, isolated soul who once scrubbed floors and dreamed of a different life. That version of me would have been paralyzed by the brutality and shadows of this world, she would have fled in terror. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone forged in the intense heat of his dangerous reality. I had been tested by the darkness and emerged stronger, discovering a hidden well of ruthlessness that mirrored his own. My love for him had transcended mere emotion, becoming something sacred, a devotion that anchored my soul. This marriage means nothing, I whispered, playfully throwing back the cruel, dismissive words he had uttered on the day of our wedding. My voice was a soft caress, a teasing reminder of how far we had come. In response, a slow, breathtaking smile transformed his face, a rare expression of warmth that he reserved exclusively for me. No, he corrected softly, leaning down to claim my lips in a kiss that felt like both a solemn vow and a silent prayer. This marriage means everything. As I gazed out at the sprawling city lights below, which glittered like a tapestry of fallen stars, a sense of profound belonging washed over me. I was no longer the girl watching from the shadows, I was Min Shu, the wife of a sovereign. I had found my place beside him, and this dark, perilous, yet magnificent kingdom was finally mine to rule. Subscribe now, like, comment and share. For more. Subscribe now, like, comment and share. For more. Subscribe now, like, comment and share. For more.